The topic of my talk, something old, something new, something borrowed, something red, China's performing arts in the 21st century, a marriage of tradition and modernity, East and West. Now say that 5 times fast. As Clay said, I worked in China for the past decade, and what's so exciting to me, what's kept me there despite all my friends and family back in the States trying to pull me back, is that despite or in addition to the thousands of years of history, so much is changing and evolving right now before our eyes. And being able to watch that, being able to be a part of that, has kept me locked there in Beijing. And today I get to share some of the artists that I've met over the last decade with you. We'll look at some both well-known and lesser-known examples of performing arts practicing today, artists practicing today, and use that as a jumping-off point for a discussion about what these artists and their art makes them Chinese. So the issue that we're looking at today in the talk is issues of identity. And this question of identity is a central question at a time when so much is changing, when so many new things are bubbling up and happening in a country. And it's an issue that citizens across China are thinking about. The government's grappling with this issue. Scientists, people in all kinds of industries are grappling with issues of identity and what is modern China. And so, of course, this is reflected in the arts. So normally I end my talks with this slide of a lot of questions, but I'm starting today's talk with questions because I think the issue of identity is about questions and questioning. Questioning assumptions, questioning your background, your context, where you're going. So these questions, we say we're looking at arts, modern art in China today. So what is Chinese modern dance, theater, music? We'll be looking at performing arts today, not visual arts. What makes it modern? What makes it Chinese? We'll look at issues of form versus content. And then who gets to decide what makes something Chinese? The artists, the audiences, the government officials, the scholars, critics, producers, funders, academics, students. Then what are the roles of the international community? As we know, China is engaged deeply in the international community now, and the international community is engaged deeply with China. So what are the roles in defining Chinese identity? What role does the international community play? And how, in this changing context, do we avoid mentalities of us versus them, or we're waiting for them to catch up to us? These are some of the, I think, pitfalls to look out for. And then another aspect of the international community is, of course, the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians, Chinese Germans, and their role in defining what is Chinese and what is global. So these are questions that have come up again and again in my 10 years plus in China, and we'll be talking about some of them today. So this is kind of the framework that of questions you can be thinking of as we start looking at these talks. So as many of you I'm sure know, China has a long and rich performing arts history. There are 56 officially recognized ethnic groups, each with their own dance, music, and vocal traditions. There are, of course, the opera traditions with musical accompaniments, so musical traditions from the opera world, movement traditions, the scripts, the literature that's part of this body of traditional theory, things like crosstalk, xiaopin, zhuan, and all these other spoken word traditions that lay the backdrop, the context of China's performing arts heritage. And then in addition to all of these traditional Chinese folk and classical forms, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, you also see foreign influence. You have the great jazz age in Shanghai in the 20s and 30s. In the early 20th century, choreographers were studying in Germany and Japan with contemporary teachers like Mary Wigman from Germany, and going back to Shanghai and going back to other cities to set up dance companies. So the 21st century, or the last 10 years, is not the first time that we see a mix of East and Western influences in the arts in China. That's been going on for a very long time. The trajectory changed a little bit from the 20s and 30s with the Chairman Mao and the rise of the Communist Party. In 1942, I'm sure many of you have studied this in your classes, Chairman Mao delivered his talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art. And this talk outlined the role that art should play in his new republic. He wrote, "Literature and art are subordinate to politics, but in their turn exert a great influence on politics. Revolutionary literature and art are part of the whole revolutionary cause. They are cogs and wheels in it." So his idea, his point, was that art for art's sake was bourgeois, people, and anti-revolutionary, that people had better things to do, like working in the fields, than contemplating the universe through some abstract interpretive dance. And forms like jazz music or modern dance were eventually outlawed as foreign imperialist art forms. This reached a head during the Cultural Revolution. At that time, all performances were outlawed except for 8 revolutionary model operas known as the Yangban-xi. 2 of these were ballets, The White-Haired Girl and The Red Detachment of Women, or as I like to call it, Girls in Tights with Guns. And who doesn't like girls in tights with guns? These the 8 model operas, including these 2 ballets, were adapted from traditional Chinese stories. Generally speaking, all of the good guys were farmers and revolutionary soldiers singing and dancing in the broad spotlight, and the bad guys were landlords and anti-revolutionaries with dark makeup and dark lighting. So we will look at an excerpt from the Red Detachment. How many of you have seen the Red Detachment of Women, either live or on video? 3, 4, okay. We'll look at a very short excerpt. I encourage you all to see it. It's one of my favorite ballets, and I'll talk about why. I love this ballet. It sometimes gets a bad rap as kitsch or kind of dated, but I actually think it's a really beautiful example of innovation. And when we talk about Chinese identity or what is Chinese art, I think this is actually a pretty spectacular example. So you have ballet. Ballet is the form, and that is from Soviet influence very directly, very much a foreign influence, but adapted. And then the content is a revolutionary story, so a Chinese story with a quote-unquote foreign form. But what I love about this ballet is you see a very clear thing they did with the form. So here you've got, this is ballet 5th position with the arms, like this. And then you take it and you make it fists, and suddenly it's Peking opera. So it's done, integrated so organically. I think it's really a spectacular example of something quite innovative, and I encourage everybody to see it. It's still part of the National Ballet of China's repertory. They perform it every year. They still tour it internationally, so there are opportunities to see it. So now we're going to jump ahead a little bit to the 1980s. Deng Xiaoping was head of the Communist Party, and his reform and opening up policies were in place, allowing China to reconnect with the outside world. You start to see quote-unquote foreign art forms come back in. Jazz starts coming back up in Shanghai. Modern dance, one of the first modern dance training programs post-Cultural Revolution, is set up in the late 80s in Guangzhou at the Guangzhou Dancing School. And you also see Cui Jian, who's known as the godfather of rock and roll, starts his career in the late 80s, early 90s. We're going to jump ahead again. Now, not many of you, only 3 of you saw the Red Detachment of Women. How many saw the opening ceremonies of the 2008 Olympics? A few more. Okay, good. In addition to the Peking opera puppets, the masses of martial artists, and the explosive reminders that ancient China invented fireworks, a foreign imported contemporary art form stole briefly but notably onto this extravaganza that was meant to show, to celebrate Chinese history, modern dance. New York-based choreographer Shen Wei was invited back to his native country to choreograph a section of this event which was meant to celebrate China's arrival onto the world stage. Shen Wei is a choreographer based in New York City. He's been there since 1994, but he's originally from Hunan province. And he left China in '94 because he felt it was not a hospitable environment for him to develop as an artist. Well, here we are in 2008 with one of the most important moments in Chinese history, and he's invited back to choreograph a section. So does this mean that China now embraces these modern art forms that were once completely outlawed? The answer is a resounding sort of. So Shen Wei left in '94 to pursue his artistic vision in the US, because at that time he knew he couldn't stay in China to develop as a modern dance choreographer. 14 years later, the situation is indeed much different, and China was happy to invite back its native son who'd made good abroad. But it's not as if Shen Wei is about to go back and set up shop in Beijing. It's still a very difficult environment in which to be a modern dance or theater or music creator, but for very different reasons now than 15 or even 10 years ago. The expectation that China will be the next superpower extends not only to politics and economics, but to the cultural realm as well. But with the country's rapid economic development come new challenges. And what I see going on right now in China is sort of a threefold identity search. They are reconstructing a tradition and a past that was interrupted during the Cultural Revolution. So reconnecting with traditional forms, folk forms, classical idioms that were either outlawed or sort of lost traces of. So they're reconstructing a past. Then they're deconstructing it because, like many of you know, you're not necessarily as an artist going to just keep recreating what you were given. So you have to deconstruct it to question these assumptions you have. And then you need to create something new. You have to create your own voice, your new language for yourself as an artist and to say what you want to say. So these three things are happening at the same time, reconstructing, deconstructing, and then constructing again. And I'm not talking about the buildings in China. So you have millennia of traditional art forms followed by an influx of international influences. It's a period of tremendous creativity in China right now because you have a vast store of creative fodder from which to choose from and a newfound freedom to experiment with it. Before we look at some of the arts, let's look at the context then that these artists are working in. I see two forces affecting the context in which the artists are working. One's internal and one's external. Internally, there are ongoing struggles within China to survive and develop work as artists in an increasingly commercial environment. There's still very few systematic structural support systems for independent artists. Then internationally, an external force, there's pressures of a voracious international demand from festivals, producers, arts organizations abroad who are able to provide certain kinds of infrastructural and funding support not available in China. But with this support comes a different kind of explicit or implicit demands on what kind of work they want, when they want it, and what their expectations of how this art will or won't be quote unquote Chinese. So it's difficult to be a modern artist in any country. That's what's unique about China's situation. One of the first things that comes to mind for everyone in talking about contemporary performing arts, the biggest struggle, the biggest difficulty is money, funding. Where are you going to get your funding? So this is universal. What's unique about China's situation is that the funding structure is changing. It's being completely overhauled. So there isn't yet an infrastructure in place to support contemporary or independent performing arts. As you probably know, once everything was a planned economy, everything was state-owned, operated, and supported. This included all of the performing arts organizations, all of the dance and theater companies, the music organizations, the venues, the festivals, everything was a state-owned enterprise. By the late 90s, culture and art groups had a second option. If they didn't want to be a government organization, they could be an independent private enterprise, but it was under the same tax bracket as commercial organizations. So they were taxed at the same level as a karaoke bar or a restaurant or other commercial manufacturers. So it was very high tax status for these arts organizations. Individuals could not register arts organizations until 2005. So you couldn't say, oh, I'm a choreographer, I want my own dance company, or I'm a director, I'd like to set up the Joe Schmo theater organization. You could do it off the grid, but there was no official way for you to register as an organization. And without registering, you can't exist officially, you can't partner with theaters or festivals. Nonprofit status essentially doesn't really exist at all in China. On the books, you can officially register as a nonprofit arts organization. There are only 2 in the entire country. There are 2 dance companies that are nonprofit status, but technically speaking, it's a really complex procedure to do that. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, there's no nonprofit in China when it comes to arts and culture. So there's not yet a system in place of philanthropy or corporate sponsorship, and foundations are few and far between, and those don't support individuals. In the late 90s, this meant that contemporary performing arts groups were forced to depend primarily on international touring fees for their survival. And with much of their time spent touring abroad, that left very little time back within China to develop audiences. If your survival depends on touring internationally, it's very difficult to then develop homegrown audiences because all of your time is spent abroad. This leads to a rather vicious cycle. If there are no audiences for your work, then there are no ticket sales. Well, with no ticket sales, it's very difficult to ask or to get theater venues to program you because they're not going to make any money. Well, if no one's programming your performances, you're not going to be able to develop audiences. Repeat. So we've got this vicious cycle going on. The other thing that has contributed to this vicious cycle is this disassembling of the state-owned enterprises. As the government is reducing the funding for the venues and for the festivals, then they are more reliant on ticket sales because they don't have foundations or corporations to help support their venues, their theaters, and things like that. So they're looking for big-name stars to sell tickets. And why would they take a risk on something a little more experimental, a little more, something unknown? And so that also is contributing to this vicious cycle. In 2005, this disassembly of the state-owned enterprises was pretty much launched in 2005 with the 11th five-year plan. At that time, the cultural organizations began transitioning from state-owned enterprises to private companies. And so venues and festivals in China have become over-reliant on the ticket sales. You do see exceptions. Bank of China, Mercedes-Benz, these are sponsors for the National Arts Center in Beijing. And BMW is a big sponsor of the Guangzhou Opera House, but these are very few and far between. So once you get down from a big organization like the National Center in Beijing or the Guangzhou Opera House in Guangzhou, it's very difficult for individuals or smaller independent groups to look for this kind of corporate sponsorship. One result of this is a quote from Zhang Changcheng, who is the director of the Beijing Modern Dance Company. He said, because of all this increased commercialization of the context in China, it's created a very difficult situation for young artists. The difference between performing artists and visual artists is visual artists can be in a room with inanimate objects, and the resources are a little bit more at their fingertips. For performing artists, in order to create their art, they need bodies, they need space, they need audiences. It's not quite an economy of scale. And so Changcheng says that costs to put on a show are too high. Young people can't afford these high costs. So how can they have opportunities to realize their ideas? Without experience creating and producing performances, how can they develop the quality of their work as artists? So this is his concern. And the result is that many independent and contemporary companies end up relying quite heavily on international touring support to survive. Without it in China, many companies have to tour abroad, the smaller and independent ones. So we'll look at 2 examples of those guys. This one, ZuHe Niao, was founded in 2005 in Shanghai. A writer, a playwright started it. It's a collective. It's not registered anywhere, so it's one of these independent, non-registered artist collectives. Musicians, composers, set designers all partner with them. And they survive almost entirely on international touring. So this is just an excerpt of a piece they did called Teng's Memory of Home. Not exactly girls in tights with guns. And then they're based in Shanghai. Next, we'll look at a group, Tao Dance Theater. They are an independent contemporary dance company based in Beijing. They are also not yet registered, although they're working towards that direction. And founded in 2008, their primary source of income is international touring. So those are examples of two contemporary dance companies, or the first one was more dance theater, that are operating in China now in this context and searching for their voice. I think the second choreographer is very clear what his voice is. It's abstract, it's movement-based, it's non-narrative. And when he tours, very often the questions he gets are, what is it about your work that is Chinese? And his answer is, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what I personally, Taoye is his name, what Taoye has to say. I'm not interested in and nor am I capable of representing my entire country and culture and heritage. And this is the kind of response that you're seeing more and more from younger artists than the ones of the generation above who did feel a bit more of a burden to represent more than their own personal opinions or feelings of the day in their artwork. One of the reasons I think for that, well, I think it's interesting that Taoye so adamantly doesn't care to take on that burden of representing China, because if he did, he might be more likely to get funding because then the government would want to support something that they could say this represents China. Now, that said, this company was at Lincoln Center Festival this past July, and the Ministry of Culture paid for their airfare to be there. And then they were at another festival in Germany this past November, and again, the ministry paid for the airfares. So the funny thing about China is as soon as you say one thing, 5 seconds later, the opposite's true as well, because it's such a diverse country and it's changing so rapidly. So in terms of the lack of government support, it doesn't mean there's none of it. Actually, as the government scales back support for these big, massive organizations, they're starting to look for ways that they can support younger, independent, more experimental work. Now you're seeing that mainly in sending these groups abroad. They know that there's an audience and a market for independent contemporary work internationally, and they do feel that this does put a good contemporary face on the country, so they'll pay for airfare for these companies to go to prestigious international festivals. Back in China, Tao Dance Theater is going to perform at the National Center for the Performing Arts in Beijing this coming August, the Egg, which is the most prestigious, largest center for the arts in China. They're making him rent the space. They're not paying him. These artists who make no money in China have to pay the center to perform there. So it's in process. So if China lacks certain resources internally to support a growing independent contemporary art field, it would make sense for artists to turn abroad, where there are festivals, funders, art centers that want to fund it. This is a web page from 2010 during the Expo, the World Expo in Shanghai. There were different pavilions for different countries. The Dutch pavilion had not one, not two, but 3 different pavilions at the Shanghai Expo. One was only for arts and culture. They opened it over a month before the expo started, and they funded residencies for both Chinese and Dutch performing artists to do projects and collaborations in that space and then present them during the festival, or during the expo. So the international community is very active in not just bringing artists to their countries, but also doing things in China. The Dutch certainly, although sadly that may change now that they've had so much arts funding cut. There are risks, however. Nothing's ever so simple as let the foreigners pay for everything. There are risks to relying so heavily on international support, especially in an era when all eyes are so hungrily on China. Some of these risks, I think, were more risky, difficult, in the lead up to the Olympics, and they've changed a bit since then. But the biggest risk of these international market pressures was that demand overwhelmed supply. And again, this is mainly in the lead up to the Olympics, and it's changed since then. In the lead up to the Olympics, there was this voracious desire to present China to the world, understandably. But there were so few independent contemporary arts performing arts organizations that there weren't that many choices. If a festival in Germany or France wanted to present an independent collective of theater dance groups, they had 1 or 2 to choose from. So these 1 or 2 groups, it kind of didn't matter what they were going to throw on stage. They were almost guaranteed a tour. And that was wonderful for their survival. It meant income, but in terms of artistic development, it didn't necessarily lend much to that, because it didn't require a certain level of rigor. There wasn't the competition you have when there are hundreds of equally outstanding arts groups around you, and you've got to compete for those opportunities. So the amateur pieces were often invited to international festivals, eager to present something, anything from China. And again, this has changed. The other result was there weren't as many of those kinds of residencies that I just talked about with the Dutch. So it was very much about commerce, about buying and selling a piece, and therefore international touring was very much about money to survive. It wasn't about developing yourself as an artist, nor was it about helping audiences abroad better understand China. The companies would come, perform, and leave, and there wasn't a more in-depth discussion or representation of what context are we performing in, what context are we living in and making work in China, and how can we share that with audiences internationally so they better understand our work. I personally am of the opinion that dance and theater and music are not a universal language. I think like spoken languages, they have a historical and a cultural background that you need to understand in order to speak and to understand a language. And so I think one thing we do with Ping Pong Productions is try to get as much of that contextual background with all of our projects and tours so that it's not just about buying and selling a product, but about engaging countries and cultures. And in the early lead up before the Olympics, a lot of the cultural exchange or a lot of the touring, that wasn't happening so much. It was much more about buying and selling. And so that international touring became about financial exchange and not so much about artistic or cultural exchange. So again, this is not to begrudge groups the amazing opportunity to go abroad. That was key at that time so that they could continue to survive, to continue making work and developing themselves as artists and developing their artistry. And now that the Olympics are over and a lot of the hyper-attention is calming down, we are starting to see a shift. There are also more and more companies now, so the competition is growing as well. Now, not all arts are developing at the same pace. I've been focusing a lot on independent contemporary dance and theater groups. We also have artists like Long Long, all-star celebrities. You'll notice the Adidas shoes. He's got many corporate sponsorships. It helps to be a celebrity for an art form. He went to Curtis Institute of Music, so he studied abroad as well. He's worked with international conductors, and now he's back in China. And so the arts in China are developing at different rates. You don't see Shen Wei coming back to China yet. You do see Long Long coming back. You do see the conductor Tan Dun coming back to China. And I think that this is mainly two reasons. One, it's the classical music got a start in China much earlier than contemporary dance did. Classical music, the minute the Cultural Revolution was over, the conservatories opened their doors again for students. There was much more exchange very early on. And then I think you're also dealing with a classical art form. It's why ballet still has more of a foothold in China than, say, contemporary dance or other forms. China, with its rich history, is familiar with classical art forms, whether it's classical Chinese dance, Peking opera styles, but certainly classical music, ballet. Those are able to find an audience and find structural support in China to a larger degree than, say, Xiao He, who is an independent indie rocker. He is also of this opinion that he can draw on anything from Peking opera to punk rock to influence his music. He's of a same generation as Tao Ye. When he tours abroad and people ask him what's Chinese about his music, his response is very often, I'm what's Chinese about my music. So we have a very brief excerpt that we'll look at now and then move on. But this is Xiao He in all his glory. So some of the trends you see in China are not at all different from the trends you see in the States or in Europe. Classical music has a bigger audience than contemporary experimental sound design. What the difference in China is that it's such a recent history for some of the more contemporary forms that they're battling not only for their own company's existence and development, but for the entire form itself. So for example, there was a 2006 study of how many contemporary dance companies there were in New York City, and the number was almost 300 in New York City alone. In 2006, in all of China, there were about 5 contemporary dance companies. So if one company disappears in New York, it's too bad for that company, but the art form ain't going anywhere. When you're looking at China, if one of those 5 disappeared, that's a large percentage of that entire art form going away. So in this difficult context, the artists are not only kind of fighting for their own survival, but for that of their entire art form. They're building audiences, they're building understanding, at the same time as having to build their own voice. They don't come out as geniuses to lead the charge. Some of the work, it requires trial and error. And so what ends up, some of the risk of that early fervor before the Olympics with all these amateur pieces being put on as representative of China, it was almost unfair that this trial and error process of young artists developing had to then already be a finished product when it wasn't necessarily ready. So those are some of the risks. So what is modern? Right now in China, modern means choice. Artists can do what they choose with the materials at their disposal, not just recreate traditional art forms. And it also means they don't even have to touch those traditional art forms if they don't want to. In 2006, when I worked for the Beijing Modern Dance Company, I'd often encounter festival producers and presenters who said to me, well, I don't need to present another modern dance company, but I want something that looks Chinese. Does the company look Chinese? And the idea was that the value of that company lay in its Chineseness, not in its artistry. And those questions that would often come internationally were not thought through. I mean, when I'd ask them what they meant by that, often they'd get quite defensive, but there was not a thorough kind of thinking through on their behalf. And then on the flip side, within China, as these groups were performing their work, very often they'd come up against the same questions. Journalists in China, government officials in China would say, well, what's Chinese about what you're doing? How are you not just imitating Western forms? And I very much like Willie Cao's response to this. He's a director of a company in Beijing. He said, in China, not only the government officials come to tell you what you must do, that you must do something ethnic with ethnic Chinese characteristics, but also the Western critics say, well, since you're from China, you shouldn't copy us, you should have your own voice. But I think this is modern society, and in modern society, it's not about whether it's Western or Eastern, but it's a matter of choice. So I come back to the questions that we started the talk with. What is Chinese modern dance or theater or music? What makes it modern? What makes it Chinese? Who gets to decide? What are the roles of the international community and also the identity of the diaspora? One thing that was really interesting, the conversations when Shen Wei came back to choreograph for the Olympics, all of a sudden he was being called a Chinese choreographer based in New York. But then his company would show up on the scene, and his company was all white and black dancers, white and black Americans. There were no Asians in his company. So then the question was, well, if he's a Chinese choreographer, what's his company? Is that American? Is that Chinese? And it further complicates the question. And I think that in this discussion of identity, that it's worth ending as we begin with questions, because identity is a searching of these questions. And with that, I would like to open it up to your questions. Thank you very much.